To those of you who are just joining us now, and on behalf of the Solberg Institute for Migration and Mobility, the Center for Public Scholarship, the Social Research Journal, the Global Studies Program, the JD Program in Latin American Studies, the New School Community, and myself, Alexandra Delano, and my co-editor and colleague, Benjamin Nines, we are delighted to be here today to mark the publication of Borders and the Politics of Mourning, and to share this conversation with most of the authors who collaborated in this project. But we are very honored to have the opportunity to expand on this dialogue with Judith Butler, whose work has had such a profound influence on each of us and on the work that we are presenting in this special issue. As this project has developed, the number of migrant deaths in the Mediterranean has grown to over 5,000 a year, adding to the hundreds that continue to take place every year here in the US-Mexico border, in Southeast Asia, and many other parts of the world, and that have been taking place for decades, not just now. The images of dead migrants and body bags have become ubiquitous in the debate about the so-called refugee crisis, to the point of losing their initial shock value, as thousands remain unidentified, buried in hinterlands, or disappeared with no mechanisms to search for them, leaving thousands of families in limbo. This has led us to question through the research, activist and artistic interventions represented in this project, where and how alternative responses can be articulated to respond to the conditions that generate such inequalities in life and in death, and to demand responsibility and accountability for them.
Collectively, the set of articles is especially interested in examining how grief transforms into a public demand, when and how grief for strangers gains a political force, and whether our exposure to loss can serve as a new basis of community, as Judith Butler has asked, and so powerfully interrogated over the years. When, if ever, does mourning actually amount to tangible political effects? And is public grief an exercise of state power or its very challenge? And this came up earlier in the panel a lot. Banu Bagu talked about the constant tension between promise and co-optation. Rukat Leach talked about the fact that maybe mourning is most political when it shows an anti-political logic. And a recent piece by Judith Butler after the Paris attacks in 2015 was called Mourning Becoming the Law. So I think grappling with very similar issues. When is mourning the challenge of state power? When is it just an expression of it? In particular, the articles are concerned with communities of grief that do not follow a clear-cut territorial logic. The aesthetic and political interventions examined in this issue often employ established rituals and symbols of mourning and remind us of the inherently social aspects of grief. They also show us, however, that collective mourning does not simply reproduce the cohesion of established groups, as Durkheim would have it, but also creates openings to reflect on a shared vulnerability and different distributions of vulnerability across borders. And they remind us that acts of mourning can sometimes also be a source of democracy's agon, as well as generators of new forums that defy territorial constraints. We would now like to welcome Chiara Bottici, Associate Professor of Philosophy here at the New School, author of Imaginal Politics and the Philosophy of Political Myth, among many other works, who will introduce Professor Butler for us. Thank you very much.
Thank you, both organizer, for having me here and for having me be part of this event. It's really my great pleasure to introduce Judith Butler, not only because we have already been talking about their work for 2 hours, but she just flew in now, so we finally have the opportunity to actually hear what she thinks, not what we think she thinks, which is particularly nice. I would like to keep the introduction short because I'm sure everybody's eager to listen to her lecture. So we'll keep it to a minimum. I will briefly only mention the importance of her work, numerous publications, which in a field like philosophy is not so much measured with the importance of the answers that one gives to philosophical questions, but rather that's really the landmark of a great philosophical work, with the capacity to actually raise questions that had not been raised before, and in her case, even to begin a whole field of studies, right? Certainly this happened, I don't need to mention it, here at the New School, the way she changed the field of study of gender, for instance. But I think something similar, as we have seen in the previous 2 hours, happened when she raised the question, when is life grievable, right? And I think this special issue is really indebted not so much to the, not only to the answers that she gave, but to the very fact that she pointed to the importance of raising the question in the first place. So I want to keep the introduction brief. As I said, I will only mention other works that have not been mentioned in the 2 hours before. In particular, I would like to mention her last publications, Senses of the Subject, published in 2015, Notes Towards a Performative Theory of Assembly, also published in 2015, and what I think is particularly relevant for our discussion, the forthcoming edited volume, Vulnerability and Resistance, which is forthcoming with Duke University Press. So we have plenty of reason to be enthusiastic and to welcome her. The title of her talk, Keynote, will be Grievability and Resistance, so please join me in a warm welcoming for Judith Butler.
Thank you. I'm really pleased to be here. I always have to adjust to the notion of the human implied by the microphone. It's especially an honor to be here at the Zolberg Institute to see Marigold Zolberg here today. And I thank all of you who have organized this important and timely conference. And I'm only sorry that I am coming in late, but I had my own teaching responsibilities yesterday that I was unable to evade. Borders and the politics of mourning. Well, the topic is very timely. We are, I think, challenged to bring our intellectual resources to bear on the organization of, to reflect on the organization of deprivation and death that has taken place along the extended borders of Europe. It is true that nearly 5,000 people have died trying to cross the Mediterranean, half of those in this year alone. And in recent days, some have also died, although hundreds, thousands have been saved. And we are also, I think, seeing now not just the migration of the Syrians and the Kurdish people, but also migrations from North Africa, which may well accelerate in the coming months and years. The violence at the border, extended now actively operating as a violence of the border beyond its geographical site. That is another topic we have to think about. If we think about the border that the sea is, or the border that is somehow invisibly in the sea, we are confronted with the question of how that border is determined and interpreted, and how, as a result, the responsibility for letting die or securing life is differently assigned. Although some of my examples this evening focus on Europe and what is termed the graveyard of the Mediterranean, I am also mindful of the destruction of Calais, the brutal treatment of Syrians amassed on the border of Turkey, the differential ways that anti-Muslim racism works in Europe with anti-Black racism in both Europe and the United States. And I'm also mindful of the border of Mexico, which has become, as we know, the site of racial panic and hatred in the contemporary presidential election. It's going to be over soon, and it's going to be okay. That is to say, we will be taken to the streets to oppose Hillary Clinton, and she's the one we want to be opposing. Okay. That's our view. Okay. In any case, there are all forms of lethal power. These are all forms of lethal power in which the field of ungrievable life is produced and managed for both the living and the dead, and this will be an important point. Because when we speak of a life as ungrievable, that life can be alive, or that life can be dead. And when we speak, and I hope to be able to consider that in what I have to say this evening. So as we consider the radical abandonment of populations at or near, and here I'm saying the border, to let it float and refer variously and indefinitely, or when we consider the border itself as the spatial articulation of the power of abandonment and destitution, we have before us, I think, another set of questions. Who is left to die? And who is considered living? And who is, as living, already considered good as dead? Who mourns those who live in the zone of social death? In fact, I would answer many people do, since the status of ungrievability is a contested and uneven one. And, as I will try to make clear in my remarks this evening, I believe there are forms of contesting ungrievability that constitute significant forms of resistance. I see the whole problem of ungrievability as opening up the possibility of a transversal solidarity among those who are struggling against violent annihilation and managed destitution of Black life here in the US and in many other places in the world, as well as those who are defending the claims of refugees against the racist logic of exclusion and expulsion throughout Europe. When a population is asserted and acknowledged as grievable, which is surely one meaning of Black Lives Matter, there is already a certain resistance to the neutralization or rationalization of both precarious life and devastating loss. So as we try to consider the forms of resistance to abandonment and death that happen in and by the border, we are compelled to find the forms by which grievability is asserted. Indeed, one question I hope to pose is what counts as a militant assertion of grievability? What showing up and moving forward of the exposed and precarious body attests to the necropolitical conditions under which it lives, resisting those very conditions? How does the militant assertion of grievability operate in relation to resistance? This question I hope to approach in some of what I have to say this evening. My answers can be gestural at best within the context of an academic paper in an academic setting at a very set amount of time. But I do think academic papers can be important because it's a moment where we have the chance to register and respond to a demand that is being made of us from a world that is broader than the academic one. And it is important that we seek to try to find language with which to respond and with which to help others find a way to respond. The first section of my paper is called The Demographics of Grievability. The abandonment of populations along the extended borders of Europe raises fundamental questions about when and where a population is designated as a set of lives worthy of life. That question presupposes another, namely whose lives are considered potentially grievable lives. For lives that do not count as potentially grievable stand very little chance of being safeguarded or supported. We can ask what stops us from killing. Many philosophy classes ask that. When we talk about violence, we ask why is it we do not kill. But there's of course a more difficult question, which is under what conditions are we responsible for letting people die? And whoever that we is who's posited at that moment has to think not only about violence as something that is enacted through a direct physical blow, but also violence as something that is allowed to happen or let to happen through the reproduction of policies and institutions and practices that go uncontested. Whether or not we pose such questions about individual others, specific groups, or all possible people matters greatly, since what we take for granted about the nature of individuals and groups, and even the ideas of humanity that we invoke in such discussions, very often activate demographic assumptions, including pervasive and lethal fantasies about who counts as a human, whose lives belong to the lives that compose humanity, whose lives are worth preserving or safeguarding and whose lives are not, and what defines and limits our operative notions of humanity. I've suggested elsewhere that the category of grievable life might be useful as we seek to show how an idea of the equal value of lives is compromised by the unequal distribution of grievability. We might say that for equality to make sense as a concept, it must imply that formal extension to all humans, but even then we make an assumption about who is included within the category of the human and who's partially included and who is in fact fully excluded. Moreover, why should we restrict our ethical concern for life to human life? For all these reasons, we cannot take the given notion of the human as the ground of our analysis. It is a concept differentially articulated in the context of inegalitarian forms of social and political power. The field of the human is constituted through basic exclusions, haunted by the figures that do not count in its tally. In effect, the unequal distribution of grievability enters into and distorts our deliberate ways of thinking about violence and nonviolence, but also our understanding of who's considered worthy of grief and whose life we wish to keep on living. One might expect that a consideration of grievability pertains only to those who are dead, but my contention is that grievability operates already in life, even at the very inception of life. It is a characteristic attributed to living creatures, marking their value within a differential scheme of values, and bearing directly on the question of whether or not they are treated equally, and whether the world is organized in such a way to sustain or abandon their lives, to foreclose or to open their futures. Whether the presumption from the start is that this life, these lives, will be subject to early and violent death, whereas others will be provided with what they need to survive and to flourish. But also the sudden or gradual collapse of the world that necessitates flight, trusting the horrible stranger with a profit motive and a poorly crafted boat, being discovered by the Italian and Greek Coast Guard only to find that one is in a legal non-zone, facing the impossibility of transit, subjected to closed borders, unsanitary conditions, detention, the suspension of national and international rights, and the repeated challenge of how to survive, to move, to arrive. All these, of course, are part of what are indices of the degree to which life is considered grievable or ungrievable. There are so many ways to talk about violence in these scenes. We cannot let violence take a single form, but as we start to refine our vocabulary, it seems crucial to consider how demographic assumptions pervade our debates about violence, both the determination of when violence happens, to whom it happens, to whom it can happen by definition, and what forms of institutionalized and non-institutionalized life count as violence. What I hope ultimately to argue is that to recognize the unequal distribution of the grievability of lives can and should transform our debates about both equality and violence. I doubt I can make my way all the way through those arguments this evening. The case of refugees amassed at the borders of Europe or attempting to cross the Mediterranean from Libya or Turkey raises immediately the question of who's grievable and what kind of violence is at work when lives are left to languish or forced into dying. I say forced into dying, even though I probably should just say killed, but I wanted to hold on to the indirect way in which death dealing takes place. Who is leaving the populations at sea in such cases, and who is to blame, or how is blame to be assigned? Should it be to individuals or policymakers? Should it be the people who made those terrible boats and took that money, who exploited the political fear and desperation of those they brought onto those boats? should we be considering the policies which reproduced time and again orchestrate the abandonment of populations seeking, among other things, shelter, legal passage, food, movement, belonging, and futurity? Even as there are officials who decide to vacate humanitarian obligations, for instances, and there are individuals who take their boats out on a daily basis to do something very different, that is to try to assist in the transport of those who cannot cross the sea with the boats and conditions they face, whose lives are imperiled or in fact lost. It's important to mark that there are these extraordinary humanitarian efforts, the Greek Coast Guard for sure, and most recently the Italian boats that have been collecting people from the water in the last week. But we would be making a mistake if we simply took the model of the moral individual as our source of hope. If the model of the moral individual is our source of hope, that means we don't really have very much faith in politics. We don't really have very much faith in policies. We don't really have very much faith in structural, organizational, political solutions. So as much as I applaud those people who do go out on a daily basis to scour the waters and bring in whoever they find, I don't want their humanitarian virtue, and it is a humanitarian virtue, to blind us from the structural problem at issue. So how do we think about that? Well, I think that the broader policies that are circulating and normalizing the abandonment of life are to some degree dependent on operative conceits of national sovereignty and ethnically pure notions of the nation state that serve as supervenient principles in relationship to international accords. International accords, in other words, are periodically and regularly suspended in the name of national sovereignty. That supervenient assertion of sovereignty depends upon a border, and yet the border, however it is drawn, and precisely because it is drawn, is always to a certain degree imagined, a site for the articulation for an imagined nationality. The boundary is hardly passive, it is an active drawing, you might say. It bounds and preserves, protects and defends. It also expels and purifies. It acts as a barricade against figures of racial contamination that threaten to destroy the nation. Indeed, the border not only separates one space from another, the border takes up space and it organizes space. It even puts space to work. It is less a dividing line between legal entities than an extra-legal zone in which some laws are suspended and other laws and regulations are intensified precisely in that zone. And that happens in tandem with systematically induced forms of expulsion, abandonment, and death dealing. So one thing I'll just say, a little polemic, brief polemic, JB, is that we cannot think about lives that are in the border zones as bare life, that is to say, as being abandoned by the law. They are subject to an intense number of regulations, an intense number of powers. They are not. They might be suspended from protection by one sovereign law, but they also will be regulated and intensely monitored and barred by several forms of regulatory power, including other laws that might be international. So let's not imagine it as a place of metaphysical barrenness. That's not what's happening there. Okay, that was not at all mean-spirited. I thought it was going to come out much worse. Okay. Aging helps. Okay. In any case, here I want to say the border is a spatial articulation of those forms of legal violence, legal protection, sovereign decision, and biopower that work in mixed formations. in mixed formations. And it's not always possible to predict in advance what kind of conglomeration that will be. At the same time, the border is re-articulated in time. It is a way of organizing time, distinguishing time, and again, between who may move and who may not, who will have futurity and who will not. As you know, the Mediterranean is carved into distinct national territories, but also managed by maritime laws adopted by the surrounding countries. The Barcelona Convention, adopted in 1975, enjoined 16 different nations to protect the sea, preserve biodiversity, but also to assume common responsibility for emergency situations on the sea. International maritime law stipulates the obligation to offer assistance to those in distress without regard to the nationality, status, or circumstances of the person or people at risk. We find the same principle not only in the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, 1982, but earlier in the International Convention on Maritime Search and Rescue, 1979. The activist group Watch the Med, which receives and relays SOS calls from refugees imperiled on the Mediterranean, describe the regulatory powers that govern the sea in the following way, and I quote, "The current structure of the maritime territory and the codification of states' rights and responsibilities at sea is mainly established by the 1982 United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea. Maritime jurisdictions today resemble an unbundled sovereignty in which the states' rights and obligations that compose modern state sovereignty on the land are decoupled from each other on the sea and applied to varying degrees depending on the spatial extension and the specific issue addressed." So if we wish, following Foucault, to separate sovereign from biopolitical power under circumstances such as these, we are hard-pressed to find that line. Sovereignty is unbundled precisely because sovereign claims are limited, distributed, connected, and disconnected, producing a strategic field in which one claim can take priority over another depending on circumstance, but no one sovereign principle maintains a supervenient status, and no one post-sovereign principle, that is to say international principle, claims supervenient status either. So regardless of our assessment of the politics of humanitarianism, that's a big subordinate clause, sorry. It's surely good to know that according to the UN conventions that govern the sea, the obligation to extend aid applies without regard to nationality, status, or circumstances of the person or people in distress. This is a broad and relatively simple rule. It applies to ship owners, ships masters, coastal nations, and flag states, that is, the states where ships are registered. They each bear equal responsibility for search and rescue. And yet periodic eruptions of state sovereignty contest the reach and applicability of such a convention. As Watch the Med explains, that unbundled sovereignty that describes the power that governs the sea produces a situation in which, and here I quote, "a state's rights and obligations that compose modern state sovereignty on the land are decoupled from each other and applied selectively. This allows states to extend their capacity to control vessels beyond their boundaries, but also attempt to retract themselves from the obligations defined by national and international law." And here, of course, I would remind you that these states have signed these accords, so they have used their sovereign power to sign. They have pledged and promised with their sovereign power to follow those rules. So that is a deliberate and legal self-limitation of sovereign power undertaken by sovereign power taking the form of a signature, of being a signatory. That is what being a signatory is. The enforcement of the so-called Dublin regulation, which sets out that the first state of entry of an asylum seeker in the EU is responsible for following his or her claim in relationship to these, since that Dublin regulation, coastal states have been increasingly hesitant to disembark migrants intercepted at sea and have practiced what are called pushbacks, deporting them without considering their claim to asylum. Okay, that's the end of the quote from Watch the Med. So the pushback happens at the border, or even beyond the border, in an effort to protect the border, right? The boat goes to the border, goes beyond the border to protect the border because you don't want the migrant coming to the border. The border is in need of protection, which means one goes beyond the border to do that. And of course, that allows the state who has sent those ships to make the claim that the refugees did not actually arrive in the country, did not actually pass into the jurisdiction that is bound by the Dublin regulation to process their asylum. Indeed, arguments are increasingly made that refugees never arrived, they were only passing through, and that the nation state in question is nothing other than a transit route. There was no stopping, there was no stopping. Indeed, under this condition in which states seek to deploy the border to argue that refugees are not arriving, have not arrived, but are only and always passing through, indefinitely passing through, we have no option but to call upon Kafka to help clarify the legal situation at the border. I am sorry. I mean, the Messiah comes, you might remember, not on the day of his arrival, but on the very last day. The refugee comes, but never on the day of his arrival, and still does not arrive, not even on the very next day. No arriving. Arriving engages that legal obligation, no arriving. As we have recently seen, boats leave Libya time and again. This week, I believe, 11,000 people sought to leave North Africa by boat, by rickety and unregulated boats, and they capsize. And that, of course, happened not long ago in April of this year near Malta. SOS messages are sent out across the communication networks, and those messages are at once received and refused by a host of neighboring nations. In April of this year, 500 lives were lost, so we have to think about the fact that the SOS signals are received, sometimes relayed by MedWatch itself, and refused or not acknowledged. The indirect assertion of national autonomy at the expense of lives destroys the system of obligations that govern that sea with impunity. So there may be no precise sovereign decision to kill those 500 people, and yet the invocation of sovereignty under these conditions kills. For it's not just that the boat happened to capsize, but that the boats are themselves unregulated and illegal. And it's not just that some responsible government had its own fleets too far away at the time, so sorry. It's rather that a government refuses the call and refuses to send its ships, invoking sovereignty, because they do not understand themselves as the ones who should be called. They do not want responsibility for granting asylum to those refugees or even processing the papers, only to find out that there is no destination that will take them. The unbundled character of state sovereignty means that sovereignty is differently operative in a loosely connected set of laws, and that a state can shift from one set of laws to another, or from a law to a regulation back to a law, even shift the jurisdiction, national or regional, international, under which it acts at any given time and in relation to any given call. So it's a strategic field, we see, these laws and regulations. So though a government's refusal to respond to the call from the sinking boat does not take the form of a judge pronouncing a death sentence, we might argue that morally and politically we are looking at its equivalent. The sea is at that moment a partitioned set of sovereign territories, but sovereignty itself is understood in each instance to be a discontinuous or not fully unified bundle. The sovereign power suspends the maritime contract, fails to honor the conventions that have been paradoxically signed by the sovereign, secured by sovereign power, and failing to respond, the state redraws, I would say redraws performatively the jurisdictional line, reinforcing and reprioritizing sovereignty through that act. Further, the refugees do not belong to the population whose lives that sovereign is bound to protect or preserve. The sovereign at such an instant retreats from the contract, represents the sovereign nation, the nation state, the imaginary of the nation in its racial or ethnic purity. So So those who enter are, yes, disenfranchised, abandoned, imperiled, or left to die, covered by no binding obligation. At such a moment, such populations are abandoned, but they are also established as ungrievable. What language of power do we have for such a studied, deliberate, and disavowed failure to comply with international conventions that govern those waters? How do we understand this abandonment, the refusal to respond to the call? We could consider the crisis of internationalism or revisit the key Foucauldian distinction between sovereign and biopolitical power, or recast the biopolitical as the necropolitical in Achille Mbembe's terms, within whose work lives are described as managed into abandonment at the border or left to die at sea. Before I briefly reapproach those distinctions, I hope first to clarify what is meant when we say that a population is regarded as ungrievable or has become ungrievable within specific terms of power. A population that is abandoned or left to die, whose lives do not count as lives within a framework that distinguishes on demographic grounds the grievable from the ungrievable, what political language is available to describe the situation? Are ungrievable lives even considered lives, or is it the case that when and if a life or a set of lives become regarded as ungrievable, they cease to be considered as living? Is the ungrievable life regarded as a non-living life? If so, in what sense? Let me offer two caveats about grievability. The first is to concede that to speak of grievability is an awkward way to speak. Someone in a French department once told me it was an unlovely term. I'm sorry. I don't know why I had to say they were in a French department. The first is to concede that to speak of grievability is awkward. One reason for this is that we're used to asking whether subjects are capable of grieving. That was indeed the vastly important question posed by the study published in Germany in 1967 called The Inability to Mourn by Alexandra and Margareta Mitterlich. That text, building upon Freud's work on melancholia, asked whether there was in post-war Germany a failure to mourn the massive losses inflicted by the Nazi regime, but also the losses borne by German civilians. The task of that book was to show that melancholia might characterize not only an individual psyche, but a collective or shared condition, or more precisely, a national one. Whereas mourning is characterized by the acknowledgement of loss, what Freud called the verdict of reality, melancholia, as it were, refuses to hear or make the verdict, refuses to acknowledge a loss that at some level is already both registered and refused. So to speak of the grievability of a population shifts the frame to the extent that grievability is regarded as a characteristic of a population, not as a capacity of a subject, although of course the two are linked. If and when a population is grievable, they can be acknowledged as a living population whose death would be grieved were it lost, were those lives lost. Meaning that such a loss would be unacceptable, even unjust, an occasion of shock and outrage. On the one hand, grievability is a characteristic attributed to a group of people, perhaps a population by some group or community, or within the terms of a discourse. It is, for the most part, an implied attribution, and it depends on context, and it also depends and changes depending on how context shifts. In fact, my point is that people can be grieved or bear the attribute of grievability to the extent that loss can be acknowledged, and loss can be acknowledged only when the conditions of acknowledgement are established within an intersubjective field of some kind. And yet, seeking to acknowledge a loss when there is no established condition for its acknowledgement can involve acts that break through the melancholic norm. That is, I would suggest these are moments in which the performative dimension of public grieving is activated in such a way that it seeks to expose the limits of the grievable and establish new terms of acknowledgement. This would be a form of militant grieving that breaks into public space and time, portending a new constellation of space and time. We might prefer to say simply, hey, every life is grievable. We should just militate for an understanding of that basic equality. That would return us to a humanism that may still be communicable, a universalism that sets aside all of these social categories, and we would just all agree on that universal claim. We might want to make that universal and humanist claim as a descriptive one. We might even say all existing life is equally grievable, all existing human life if we're humanists, or all existing life if we're post-humanist. But if we let that be the full extent of our statement, we badly misrepresent present reality. We turn out not to be describing reality very well. So perhaps we should go frankly normative, without shame or hesitation, and say that every life ought to be grievable, thus positing a utopic horizon within which theory and description must work. If we want to argue that every life is inherently grievable, precisely to claim a natural or a priori value to our descriptive claim, what we're doing is asking our descriptive claim to carry a normative one. Every life should be, when you say every life is grievable, you're actually saying every life should be. But why would we ask the descriptive claim to do that normative work? After all, we have to point out the radical discrepancy between what is and what ought to be. Or at least start the movement of pointing that out, of keeping those distinct, at least for these kinds of debates. Theorizing within the terms of the present, the more appropriate descriptive claim is certainly not that all lives are equally grievable. So let's move from what is to what ought to be, or at least start that movement, which posits a utopic horizon for our work. And I would thank Drusilla Cornell for leading me in such a direction. My second caveat is this one. When one speaks about lives that are not equally grievable, one posits an ideal of equal grievability. Is that even possible? There are at least two implications of this formulation that pose some critical problems. The first is that we have to ask whether there's a way to measure or calculate how much anyone is really grieved. Oh. How does one establish that one population is more grievable and that another is less? Are there degrees of grievability? Surely it would be quite disturbing, if not fully counterproductive, to establish a calculus that could provide answers of that sort. So the only way to understand this claim, that some are more grievable than others, that some are within certain frames and under certain circumstances, safeguarded against danger, destitution, and death more tenaciously than others, is to say precisely, with Derrida, that the incalculable value of a life is acknowledged in one setting and not in another, or that within the same setting, if we can set the setting, some are acknowledged as bearing incalculable value and others are subject to a calculation, either explicitly or implicitly. To be subject to a calculation is already to have entered the gray zone of the ungrievable. The second implication of the formulation that not all lives are treated as equally grievable is that we have to revise our ideas of equality in order now to take into account grievability as a precondition for equality. In other words, we are not yet thinking well about equality if we have not yet considered equal grievability or the equal attribution of grievability. Grievability is a necessary condition for equality. Of course, there is yet another concern, one that I can only touch upon here, which is that the attribution of grievability to a life presupposes that a life is regarded as a life. And sometimes when a population is regarded as ungrievable, it's first deprived of its status as a living population. If it is in some sense then socially dead, or if it has been subjected within and by a necropolitical episteme, it can hardly be grieved. Only those who have been regarded as living can be grieved. Their loss can be considered as lost life. But a life that is already lost, or that was lost from the start, cannot be lost again, and so cannot be grieved, at least within these terms. And yet, as we know, the life that is lost from the start can be grieved precisely because it was quite without knowing it lost before it had a chance to live, before it had a chance even to lose its life. So when we say that a life is ungrievable, we are speaking not only about a life that is already over. Indeed, to live in the world as an ungrievable life is to know that one's death would, as a grievable life, to live in the world as a grievable life, is to know that one's death would be mourned, could be mourned, and to have a sense of living in a world in which one's death would matter because one's life mattered. But also to live this way is to know that this life will be supported and sustained because of its value, that it will have the infrastructural ground it requires to live in a world with an open-ended future, of course subject to the same contingencies as others, but not subjected differentially to more contingency than others. This way of evaluating the unequal grievability of lives is part of biopolitics, and that means that we cannot always trace this form of inequality to sovereign decision-making processes. In the final chapter of Foucault's 1976 lecture course, Society Must Be Defended, he elaborates on the emergence of the biopolitical field in the 19th century. There we find that the biopolitical describes the operation of power over humans as living beings. Distinct from sovereign power, biopolitics, or biopower, appears to be a distinctively European formation. It operates through various technologies and methods for managing life, but also death. For Foucault, this is a distinct kind of power, inasmuch as it is exercised over humans by virtue of their status as living beings. Sometimes he calls that living status a biological status, though he does not tell us which version of biological science he has in mind or what he actually means by biological life. Foucault describes the biopolitical as a power to make live or let die, distinguished from the sovereign power to take life and to let live. As in many instances in Foucault's work, power acts, but not from a sovereign center. Rather, there are multiple agencies of power operating in a post-sovereign context to manage populations as living creatures, to manage their lives, to make them live or let them die. This form of biopower regulates, among other things, the very livability of life, determining the relative life potential of populations. This sort of power is documented in mortality and natality rates that indicate the kinds of racism that belong to biopolitics. And here I would quote Ruth Wilson Gilmore, who, avant la lettre, was defining the necropolitical field. She writes, racism, specifically, is the state-sanctioned or extra-legal production and exploitation of group-differentiated vulnerability to premature death. It emerges as well in forms of pronatalism and pro-life positions that regularly privilege some sorts of life or living tissue over others, such as teenager adult women. Important for our purposes is Foucault's claim that there is no a priori right to life, that is, a right to life must first be established in order to be exercised. His argument is that under conditions of political sovereignty, for instance, a right to life, even a right over one's own death, comes to exist only for those who have already been constituted as rights-bearing subjects. This is a crucial point. Under biopolitical conditions, the right to life is much more ambiguous, since power manages populations rather than distinct subjects who are indeed subjected to sovereign power. Additionally, the relation of the biopolitical to matters of life and death is different from what he calls the relationships of war. War logics follow the dictum, if you want to live, you must take lives, you must be able to kill. The you, the on in French, is ambiguously singular and plural, so it's unclear whether war follows from self-preservation or group preservation or the preservation of any and everyone. He reformulates the basic maxim of war at least twice. In order to live, the other must die. In the first version, you yourself have to be prepared to kill, and killing is a means to preserve your own life. In the second version, in order to live, the other must die, but you yourself, you don't have to be the one who takes that life. This opens the way to other technologies and procedures by which lives can be abandoned or let to die without anyone assuming responsibility for the action. The way race enters war, or rather the way in which state racism enters into wars, often operating through biopolitical logics, is more difficult to discern in this view. Foucault has separated the biopolitical from the idea of warfare to the extent that he claims that biopower has a different relation to death. He writes, death does not swoop down, but rather regulates life and death through other kinds of, but biopower regulates life and death through other kinds of managerial and institutional logics. The days of death swooping down, well, they're not exactly over. They're certainly not over in Aleppo as we speak, even if sometimes Foucault writes as if they were to foreground another kind of power. For him, power and violence are now more indirect, less spectacular, less orchestrated by state violence. It's more difficult to separate sovereign power from the biopolitical, a point that he himself would make in subsequent lectures. And we should suspect any effort to establish a neat historical sequence in which the one clearly follows upon the other. This is especially the case if the sequence depends on a progressive version of modern European history, one which claims, well, in the old days, Europe waged wars that killed people, but now Europe deals death in more indirect and managerial ways. How does Foucault help us to return to the question about whether a life is considered not to be living at all if it is regarded as ungrievable? Well, if Foucault could claim very clearly that a right to life belongs only to a subject who is already constituted as a rights-bearing subject, one for whom life is a necessary right, can we not also then claim that the status of a living being must first be constituted for someone to become a subject with the right to life? If racism, in his view, is a way of introducing a break into the domain of life that is under power's control, a break or a caesura, then perhaps we can think of that break not merely as distinguishing between superior and inferior types within the idea of the species, which is the kind of racism that he generally references, but racism that operates by making a distinction between the living and the non-living, holding off for the idea of there being a living non-living or a socially dead. After all, if a non-living population is destroyed, then nothing of note has happened. There's no destruction, just a certain clearing away of an obstruction from the path of the living, the truly living. Foucault anticipates that critics from the field of political theory will ask about his account of life. He recedes from this debate, fearing perhaps that it would commit him to vitalism or to a foundationalist account of life that precedes contract, sovereignty, and the biopolitical. And I think if we look, for instance, at recent work in critical vitalism, the work of Frederick Worms, or some of the work that Catherine Malabou has been doing on life and the biopolitical, they are all, I would suggest, entering into this, they're trying to supplement this moment or enter into this moment that Foucault left vacant. He changes the subject. He, in fact, does it twice towards the end of this book. The first time when he's called upon or calls upon himself to define life, oh, I can't do that. Fearing foundationalism, fearing vitalism. And then the second time where he comes up with a concept of state racism. And we're ready to go. Like, yes, we're going to analyze state racism. Caesura, right there. All this is a debate within political philosophy that we can leave to one side, he claims. But it clearly demonstrates how the problem of life came to be problematized within the field of political thought. The issue of life cannot be set aside. The problem is not that we'll return to a metaphysics of life that turns out to be insupportable, but that we have to consider carefully the institutional fields in which it is defined, managed, and nullified. So in my view, power is already operating through schemas of racism that persistently distinguish not not only between lives that are more and less valuable, more and less grievable, but also between lives that register more or less emphatically as lives. A life can register as a life only within a schema that presents it as such. A discontinuous set of schemas makes it possible for a life to be massively mourned in one context and radically discounted in another. Perhaps this is what Frantz Fanon meant when he talked about a zone of hidden fluctuation where the people can be found. Right? Radically mourned here, totally unmourned here. Moving in a life world between those two possibilities in quick succession. The epistemological nullification or foreclosure of the living character of a population, which is the very definition of a genocidal epistemology, structures the field of the living along a continuum, we might even say a continuum that breaks intermittently, and this has implications for the question, whose are the lives that are worth safeguarding, whose lives matter, whose lives are grievable. So Foucault's reflection breaks off here, and I think we're right to wonder about that break. We can supplement it, I think, through recourse to Fanon, and especially his notion of the historic racial schema introduced in Black Skin, White Mask, as a form of perception and projection, an interpretive casing that enfolds the black body and orchestrates its social negation. In fact, Fanon distinguishes between the historical racial schema and the epidermal racial schema, which fixes an essence to black life. But it is the first, the historical racial schema, that seems to have a direct relation to Merleau-Ponty's idea of a corporeal schema and to the schemas of racism that bear un-grievability. A corporeal schema for Merleau-Ponty is the organization of tacit and structuring bodily relations with the world, but also the operation of constituting oneself within the terms made available by that world. The historical racial schema, according to Fanon, is to be found at a deeper level, and it comes to disrupt the idealized corporeal schema proposed by Merleau-Ponty. The elements of the historical racial schema are provided by what he calls the white man. Who's the white man? Well, the white man is an abbreviated figure, a figure that we might say that abbreviates the powers of racism, and casts the black bodily experience of the world into certain uncertainty. On the one hand, a third-person consciousness enters into a first-person consciousness, so one's very mode of perception is riven by another consciousness. Who is seeing when I am seeing? And when I see myself, am I seeing only through the eyes of another? On the other hand, the corporeal schema describes ways of composing oneself from the elements of the world. Fanon describes this aspirational schema as a slow composition of myself as a body in the middle of a spatial and temporal world. The powerful figure of what he calls the white man is the one who had woven me out of 1,000 details, anecdotes, stories. So as he writes, he retells having been written or woven by the third person, and we see on the page the slow struggle of self-composition that follows upon the decomposition of the bodily schema through the working of racism. It is at the level of the bodily experience of oneself in a world where that schema is taken apart, expropriated, inhabited, occupied, and decomposed. Of course, Fanon uses the first and third person, figures such as the black man and the white man, to articulate this idea of the schema, but the historical racial schema is broader and more diffuse than those particular figures. In fact, such a schema bears upon the living and embodied life of populations, and so provides, I would suggest, a critical supplement to Foucault's reflections on anti-black racism and biopower. Such a historical racial schema precedes and informs as well policies on world health, hunger, refugees, migration, culture, occupation, and other colonial practices, police violence, incarceration, the death penalty, intermittent bombardment, destruction, war, and genocide. Although Foucault identifies state racism at the end of these lectures as one of the central instruments for the management of the life and death of populations, he breaks off before telling us how racism works to establish relative values for different lives. There is, of course, a clear sense that some populations are targeted by modes of sovereign power, and that there's a letting die orchestrated by biopower. But how do we account for the differential way ways in which lives and deaths matter or fail to matter. If we take racialization as a process by which a racial schema is materialized in the very perception of whose life matters and whose does not, then we can proceed to ask, how do such differentiated modes of perception enter into military and policy debates regarding targeted populations and incarcerated people, or structuring the forms of abandonment and death dealing that we see on the borders of Europe and in the passageways between them, among all those countries. To extend the analysis further, we would have to understand the particular ways in which anti-Arab and anti-Muslim racism work, how they operate in the very definition of European forms of nationalism, or the massive violence along the border and into the sea that has time and again characterized the Australian state in relation to any number of Southeast Asian people seeking asylum there. And I barely mentioned the border of Mexico, along which thousands have died from dehydration and exposure because safe passage is refused by the U.S. government. And perhaps today you also talked about the fact that it's not just the border of Mexico with the United States, but it's all the borders moving north. Right, so the Honduran border never gets the same amount of attention as the Mexican border, for instance. Of course, there's a very important group called No Mas Muertes, which seeks to ward off and preempt those losses, moving through the deserts in southern Arizona, trying to provide direction, food, water. What are they doing? Well, to indicate where I'm going, what they're doing, in my view, is asserting grievability as a form of resistance. At the end of society must be defended, Foucault opens up the possibility that populations who are precarious or abandoned are not yet constituted as subjects of rights. To understand who they are, that is to say, the way they are constituted within the political field, we need to move beyond the model of the subject. If, as Foucault has argued, under sovereign power a subject has a right to life only on the condition that the subject is constituted as a rights-bearing subject, then under conditions of biopower, a population has a claim to life on the condition that that population is registered as potentially grievable. That is at least my thesis, my way of offering a supplement to Foucault by bringing Fanon to bear on the question of how racial schemas enter into the constraining figurations of who is living, and how racial phantasms inform the demographic valuations of who is grievable and whose lives ought to be preserved, whose can be expunged or left to die. The historic racial schema that makes it possible to claim this is or was a life, or these are or were lives, is intimately bound up with the possibility of necessary modes of valuing life. Memorialization, safeguarding, recognition, the preservation of life. This is a life worth living, worth preserving. These are lives that ought to be given the condition to live and to be registered and recognized as lives. Through what actions or movements do such assertions emerge? I know you've been thinking about that all day. Well, consider the imperative contained in the title, Say Her Name, Resisting Police Brutality Against Black Women, a text published in July 2015 by the Center for Intersectionality and Social Policy Studies, led by Kimberly Crenshaw and Andrea Ritchie. Here, grievability is asserted time and again, focusing on the proper name, the story, the analysis, the law. Crenshaw and Ritchie argue that the main examples in the media illustrating police violence against Black people in the United States nearly all involve Black men, clearly showing that the dominant frames for understanding anti-Black racism and police violence operate within a restrictive gender frame, or they are a restrictive gender frame. Calling for a gender-inclusive approach to racial justice, Crenshaw has independently drawn attention to the way that Black women are over-policed and underprotected, but also how their injuries and deaths are not as fully documented or registered in their encounters with police, whether on the street, in their homes, or in detention. The archive of unjust loss, resisting the normalization of police actions and procedures by which Black life is taken time and again. The mobilization against prisons and the death penalty as central mechanisms for the reproduction of state racism are yet other forms of resistance to the death-bent ways of state racism. They also, I would suggest, are ways of asserting grievability. In claiming that grievability is linked to resistance, I do not mean to say that mourning turns to militancy over time or through some necessary logic. Nor do I wish to argue that mourning is in some ways resolved or overcome through activism. Douglas Crimp and Anne Svetovich cautioned against any easy formulations of that kind when they wrote about mourning and militancy in the context of AIDS in U.S. urban centers. It's unclear, for me at least, which law the Greek Coast Guard is obeying and which one they are defying when they take the boats out day after day from the harbor at Lesbos, collecting both the living and dead from the waters and providing health care and passage for the living, as demonstrated recently in Daphne Matsiaraki's extraordinary documentary 4.1. Utter strangers lend their bodies to one another in the midst of despair. Such lives are grievable, which does not mean that they are lost, but only that they should not be lost, should never have been lost, should never have been exposed to such loss. Resisted, then, is the naturalization of the norm according to which a population might simply be left to die. But moral actions are not sufficient in a violent political situation that continues to produce ever more refugees. The German newspaper Daily Resistance, published in Farsi, Arabic, Turkish, German, French, and English, contains articles written by refugees who have formulated a set of political demands, including the abolition of all refugee camps, the end of the German policy of Residenzpflicht, which limits the freedom of movement of refugees within narrow boundaries, the end to all deportation, and allowing refugees to work and study. A more dramatic example of resistance also emerged in Germany in 2012 when several refugees in the city of Würzburg stitched their mouths closed, protesting against the fact that the government had refused to respond to them. That gesture has been repeated in several sites, most recently by Iranian migrants in Calais in March of this year before the destruction and evacuation of their camp and community. Their view, widely shared, is that without a political response, refugees remain voiceless, since a voice that is not heard, a voice that is refused, that cannot be heard as a political voice, is not a voice. It's not regarded as a voice. The image of the stitched lips not only shows that the demand cannot be voiced, but it makes its own demand. It makes its own voiceless demand. The question of how to mourn under violent social conditions is different from the question of grievability. When Claudia Rankine wrote in the New York Times that the condition of Black life is one of mourning, she foregrounded the ways in which Black life is subject to induced precarity. In other words, the imminence of a possible unexpected death is linked to the sudden need to mourn, as she puts it, the daily strain, and here I'm quoting from her, the daily strain of knowing that as a Black person you can be killed for simply being Black, no hands in your pockets, no playing music, no sudden movements, no driving your car, no walking at night, no walking in the day, no turning onto this street, no entering this building, no standing your ground, no standing here, no standing there, no talking back, no playing with toy guns, no living while Black, end quote. We can add, no reaching for your vaping instrument, no meeting the eyes of the police. One important claim is that those who are lost ought to be grieved, understood as grievable and then grieved. But it's another claim that the living are grievable. To say that they are grievable is to say that they should not be lost, that this loss should not happen, and that the world needs to be organized in such a way to forestall that loss. In other words, the actual loss of those who are grievable gives rise to mourning. The radical assertion of grievability among and by the living gives rise to resistance to this hyper-precarious life, to protracted modes of living death, as well as to heightened exposure to sudden and violent injury, detention, and death. I think I've gone on for a long time, right? Let's move towards the end here. The bodies that resist the presumption of their ungrievability appear as such within the public. Their exposure in the context of demonstrations shows the risk of death or deportation. It brings it to the fore. It makes the wager and the demand with its own performative and embodied persistence. Okay. I'm going to just move to my final remarks, and you can ask me what was in there. Loss and grief assume different historical forms, and they are assuming new historical forms for sure. And many of us, I presume, who live in the city or in this country have heard the remark that violence is becoming increasingly unpredictable, that you don't know where to go, you don't know when you will find it, there's no way to make a plan. Well, the idea that life can be expunged at any time means we cannot predict from which direction or when violence might arrive. For some, it is a new experience, since where the imminent possibility of loss and the unpredictability of violence are part of the everyday, it's very hard to have a sense of the everyday. The wars waged elsewhere by governments such as ours, if you are a U.S. citizen, were supposed to concentrate and contain unpredictable and lethal violence at a distance from those who wage it. That distance upon which we have relied, perhaps, is now collapsing all the time. We're perhaps losing the indirect relation to the destruction to which the U.S. has contributed and continues to contribute. And it's in part that safe distance that is targeted and undermined by the contingent and unpredictable violence we now face in any and all parts of the country and in Europe. Many of the contemporary forms of violence in Europe and in the United States are surely efforts to challenge and collapse that distantiated relation to destruction that characterized or even supported, was a condition of our support of many war efforts. The fact that violence can now take place at any time or in any place, well, it may be new for many people who rest assured that they live at a distance from scenes of conflict, especially those that their governments have helped to create. But for many people, especially for refugees, but for many people in the zones of heightened conflict, there's no assurance that everyday life can continue without sudden and brutal interruption, sudden and irreversible loss. Claudia Rankine was making a similar point about Black life, the sense that it can be taken at an instant. The violence and death about which we are speaking is, of course, equally horrible no matter where it occurs and which form it takes. So, in closing, I would make a general claim: gratuitous violence is wrong in all forms and for all people. Yet to what extent do we continue to live within a world that presumes that the destruction of some populations is more acceptable than the destruction of others, whether they're actively destroyed through bombardment or indirectly destroyed through abandonment? So alongside this pervasive and unpredictable violence that has now extended into parts of the West that thought it could never happen here, is a challenge to think about the global and temporal consequences of war, state racism, and administrative forms of lethal violence that have deemed certain populations ungrievable while protecting other populations from any direct exposure to that same violence. Whatever the equality of the grievable might mean, it will not be a numerical or measurable equality, although we do have to count and document the dead. We have to produce the archive of unjust loss to assert not only that these lives were lost, but that they were lives. We will not reach equality by counting, for it is perhaps only as commonly incalculable life that we find the future of equality. Thank you very much.